In 2019, inside a genomics laboratory in Tokyo, scientists carefully extracted DNA from a 3,000-year-old skeleton. The bone was fragile, degraded by millennia, but it held genetic secrets that would shatter everything Japan believed about its own origins. When the sequence emerged from the machines, geneticists stared at data that made no sense. The genome didn't fit anywhere on the Japanese family tree. It was ancient, isolated, unique, a genetic signature found nowhere else on Earth. This wasn't just one anomaly. It was evidence of an entire civilization that history had nearly erased, a people who lived in Japan for over 10,000 years before recorded history began. A population whose DNA proves that modern Japanese identity is far more complex than anyone imagined. Tonight, we're investigating Japan's oldest DNA mystery, the discovery that reveals not one Japan, but three distinct ancestral populations, 3 waves of migration, 3 genetic legacies, all flowing together to create the Japanese people alive today. How many Japans did history forget? And what does it mean when science discovers ancestors that official narratives erased? For over a century, Japan taught its children a simple story about origins, a story of homogeneity, a story of a pure Yamato people descending from rice farmers who arrived from Korea roughly 2,300 years ago and spread across the islands, bringing agriculture and civilization. The narrative was clean, progressive, patriotic. Textbooks showed maps with arrows pointing from the Korean peninsula to Kyushu, then spreading northward and eastward. Rice cultivation transforming the landscape, pottery styles changing, language developing, a nation born from agricultural revolution. The story emphasized unity, one people, one bloodline, one unbroken cultural tradition, stretching back to mythical emperors descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu. This wasn't just history, it was national identity itself, codified in education, reinforced through ritual, embedded in how Japanese people understood who they were. But there was a problem with this narrative. It systematically erased everyone who lived in Japan before the rice farmers arrived. It treated the islands as empty space waiting to be filled by civilization. It ignored 10,000 years of human habitation that predated agriculture entirely. Archaeologists knew the story was incomplete. Shell mounds and ancient pottery sites revealed sophisticated cultures existing long before rice farming. But without genetic evidence, the scale of what had been erased remained invisible. Then, DNA technology advanced enough to read the genetic code of ancient remains, and when scientists finally decoded the genomes of Japan's oldest inhabitants, they discovered that the simple story was wrong, catastrophically wrong. The rice farmers didn't replace earlier populations, they mixed with them. And those earlier populations, the Jōmon people, had been living in Japan for over 10,000 years, developing one of the world's oldest pottery traditions and complex hunter-gatherer societies that contradicted every assumption about prehistoric life. The question became unavoidable. If the Yamato homogeneity myth was false, who were the Japanese people really? The Jōmon civilization existed in Japan from approximately 16,000 BCE to 300 BCE. Over 13,000 years of continuous occupation. They weren't primitive. They created pottery before agriculture existed anywhere on Earth, built permanent settlements, developed sophisticated fishing techniques, and maintained complex social structures across the archipelago. But by the 20th century, they had nearly vanished from Japanese collective memory, relegated to prehistory, treated as evolutionary dead ends replaced by more advanced cultures. Their archaeological sites were documented, but their significance minimized. Then in 2019, everything changed. Geneticist Hideaki Kanzawa Kiriyama and colleagues published a landmark study in Nature Communications. They had successfully sequenced complete genomes from 2 Jōmon individuals, ancient DNA, preserved in remains from the Funodomari and Ikawazu archaeological sites. When they analyzed the genetic data and compared it to modern populations, they found something that should be impossible. The Jōmon people weren't descended from the same East Asian populations that gave rise to modern Chinese, Koreans, and most other Asian groups. The Jōmon lineage had split from other East Asian populations approximately 38,000 years ago and remained genetically isolated in Japan for tens of thousands of years. They were a separate branch of human migration that had stayed in one place while the rest of East Asia experienced massive population movements and replacements. Dr. Kanzawa Kiriyama stated, "The Jōmon people are not an offshoot of recent East Asian migrations. They represent a branch that diverged early and remained distinct. This was extraordinary. The Jōmon carried genetic variants found nowhere else on Earth. They were a time capsule, a population that preserved ancient human diversity that had been lost everywhere else through subsequent migrations and population mixing." But here's what makes this discovery even more remarkable. The Jōmon didn't go extinct. Their DNA persists in modern populations, particularly in the Ainu people of Hokkaido and the Ryukyuan people of Okinawa, who carry 40 to 70% Jōmon ancestry. Ghosts in the genome, ancestors written in DNA that official history had erased. Around 2,300 years ago, something changed in Japan. New people began arriving from the Korean peninsula, bringing with them rice agriculture, bronze tools, and completely different genetics. These were the Yayoi people. Studies published in Science in 2018 and Science Advances in 2021 trace their origins to populations on the Korean peninsula and coastal China. They carried different Y chromosome haplogroups, particularly O2, and different mitochondrial lineages, like B5, that were common in East Asian agricultural populations, but absent in the Jōmon. The Yayoi migration wasn't a small group of traders or explorers. It was a massive population movement. Agricultural societies have demographic advantages. They can support larger populations, maintain permanent settlements, accumulate surplus food. Within centuries, Yayoi populations dramatically outnumbered the Jōmon in many regions. But here's where the story becomes complex. The two populations didn't remain separate. They interbred extensively. Genetic analysis by Gakuhari and colleagues in Science Advances 2021 revealed what they call a tripartite model. Modern Japanese genetics result from mixing between Jōmon, Yayoi, and a third, later wave. The mixing wasn't uniform across the archipelago. Southern islands like Okinawa maintained higher Jōmon ancestry, roughly 40%. The Ainu in Hokkaido retained even more, 60 to 70%. But on the main island of Honshu, particularly in central regions, Jōmon ancestry dropped to approximately 13% as Yayoi populations became dominant. Genetic simulations show the pattern clearly. Wave after wave of Yayoi migrants arriving, settling in areas suitable for rice cultivation, intermarrying with Jōmon populations, but ultimately outnumbering them demographically. But the story doesn't end with Jōmon and Yayoi mixing, because a third genetic wave was about to transform Japan again, and this wave would create the genetic foundation of the modern Yamato Japanese population that dominates today. Between 300 and 700 CE, during what archaeologists call the Kofun period, something profound happened in Japan. Imperial authority centralized. Massive keyhole-shaped burial mounds appeared across Honshu. State formation began. And along with political transformation came genetic transformation. A third wave of migrants arrived from the Asian mainland. Warriors, artisans, nobles connected to Chinese and Korean ruling classes. They brought advanced technologies, writing systems, Buddhist and Confucian traditions, and they brought new genes that would become the genetic backbone of the modern Japanese population on Honshu. Dr. Kenichi Shinoda's research, published in 2020, revealed that these late migrating ancestors form the core of what we now think of as Yamato Japanese genetics. They carried genetic variants common in ancient Chinese and Korean elite populations. They married into existing Yayoi Jōmon mixed communities, and over centuries, their genetic contribution became dominant in central Japan. This is the tripartite model. Jōmon, providing the deepest ancestry layer. Yayoi, bringing rice agriculture and East Asian genetics. And Kofun period migrations, introducing the final genetic component that created modern central Japanese populations. But here's what makes this discovery so profound. The official narrative of Japanese homogeneity, the Yamato myth, taught in schools for over a century, was built on erasing two of these three layers. It acknowledged only the Yayoi Kofun agricultural tradition, while treating the Jōmon as irrelevant prehistory. The genetic evidence proves this was ideological erasure, not historical truth. Modern Japanese people are hybrids carrying ancestry from three distinct sources. The supposed homogeneity was a myth constructed to serve nationalist narratives in the late 19th and 20th centuries. What got lost when one heritage became official history? What happens to a population's identity when genetics proves that the story they've been told about themselves is incomplete? Travel to the northern island of Hokkaido, and you'll find people whose genetics tell a different story than the textbooks. The Ainu people, indigenous to Hokkaido, have maintained oral traditions for centuries, claiming they were different from the Yamato Japanese to the south. Distinct language, distinct cultural practices, distinct identity. For generations, Japanese authorities dismissed these claims. Ainu culture was suppressed. Their language was discouraged. They were pressured to assimilate into mainstream Japanese society. The narrative insisted, one Japan, one people, one heritage. Then geneticists studied Ainu genomes. Research by Shimabukuro and colleagues published in 2019 revealed something extraordinary. The Ainu carry 60 to 70% Jōmon ancestry, the highest percentage of any population in Japan. They are the living descendants of the ancient hunter-gatherers who inhabited these islands for 13,000 years. The genetic evidence confirmed what Ainu oral tradition had always maintained. They were here first. They were different, and their heritage connected them to Japan's deepest history in ways that mainstream Japanese populations no longer could claim. Today, the Upopoi National Ainu Museum in Hokkaido displays this genetic evidence alongside traditional artifacts. Ainu researchers point to the DNA studies as scientific validation of what their communities always knew. But the Ainu aren't alone in preserving ancient Japanese ancestry. Travel south to the Ryukyu Islands, Okinawa, and the smaller islands of the archipelago, and you find another population that maintained elevated Jōmon ancestry. Ryukyuan people carry approximately 30 to 40% Jōmon genetics. Their language, while related to Japanese, diverged centuries ago. Their cultural traditions preserve elements that mainland Japan lost during centuries of assimilation to continental Asian models. Japan's geographic extremes, the northern and southern bookends, preserved what the center erased. The islands remember what the mainland forgot. But the Jōmon mystery extends far beyond Japan. Their genetics reveal connections that span continents and tell stories about human migration that we're only beginning to understand. One of the most fascinating discoveries, Y chromosome haplogroup D, found at high frequencies in Jōmon-descended populations, appears in only a few other places on Earth. The Ainu carry it, but so do Tibetans living thousands of miles away on the Himalayan plateau, and so do the Andaman Islanders in the Bay of Bengal, one of the most isolated populations on Earth. How can populations separated by thousands of miles share genetic markers that appear nowhere in between? The answer reveals something profound about ancient human migration patterns. Haplogroup D represents an extremely ancient migration out of Africa, possibly one of the first waves of modern humans to leave the continent over 60,000 years ago. These populations traveled along coastal routes, following the resources of the ocean, eventually reaching Southeast Asia, the Andaman Islands, the Japanese archipelago, and somehow even the Tibetan highlands. Later migrations, populations carrying different haplogroups, replaced these early coastal peoples in most regions. But in isolated areas, islands, mountains, regions protected by geography, the descendants of these first migrations survived. The Jōmon are genetic echoes of humanity's first expansion across Asia. They preserved genetic diversity that most of the continent lost through subsequent population replacements. But the connections go even deeper. Some researchers propose genetic links between Jōmon populations and ancient Siberian groups, suggesting possible kinship with the first peoples who would eventually cross into the Americas via Beringia. Mitochondrial haplogroups M9A and G found in Jōmon remains show potential connections to ancient Pacific coastal migrations that may have extended from Japan southward toward Polynesia. Dr. Gakuhari stated, "The Jōmon were not the end of a migration story. They represent a crossroads in human movement across the Pacific and Asian coastlines. The genetic map reveals that Japan was never isolated. It was a way station, a meeting point, a place where multiple ancient human lineages converged and mixed over tens of thousands of years. Today in Hokkaido, high school students participate in ancestry projects, learning about genetics and exploring their own family histories. They're discovering that their heritage isn't simple. It's complex, layered, rich with stories that official narratives never told. Geneticists continue sequencing ancient DNA from Kofun period remains, filling in the final pieces of Japan's triple ancestry model. Each new genome adds detail to our understanding of how three distinct populations merged over millennia to create modern Japanese genetics. But the implications extend far beyond Japan. This research challenges nationalist narratives of genetic purity everywhere. It proves that modern populations are always hybrid, always the product of mixing between groups that were once distinct. Every strand of DNA is not pure blood. It's shared memory. It's evidence of encounters between peoples separated by geography, united by history, connected through biology in ways that nationalist ideologies can never erase. At cultural centers in Hokkaido, Ainu musicians perform traditional songs, while projected images show double helixes and archipelago maps. The Yukar epic poems' oral histories passed down for generations are being confirmed by genetic science. The stories the elders told were true. In Okinawa, Ryukyuan cultural revival movements use genetic evidence to assert their distinct identity within Japan. They're not just Japanese. They're Ryukyuan carriers of ancient bloodlines that connect them to the first peoples of these islands. The genetic revolution isn't erasing cultural differences. It's validating them. It's showing that diversity isn't deviation from purity, but the actual foundation of all human populations. Science didn't erase Japan's origin myth. It gave it back its missing ancestors. It restored to Japanese identity the complexity that nationalist narratives had simplified away. For over 10,000 years, the Jōmon people lived on these islands. They created pottery before anyone else on Earth. They built societies that thrived without agriculture. They adapted to coastlines and forests, mountains and rivers. Then rice farmers arrived from the continent. The two populations met. They mixed. They created something new, neither purely Jōmon nor purely Yayoi, but hybrid. Then, imperial elites arrived during the Kofun period. Another mixing, another layer of complexity added to Japanese ancestry. For centuries, official history acknowledged only one of these three origins. It taught that Japanese people descended from a single pure Yamato lineage. It erased the Jōmon from collective memory. It treated the Ainu and Ryukyuans as peripheral to true Japanese identity. But DNA doesn't lie. DNA preserves what official narratives erase. And when scientists finally decoded the genetic history of Japan, they discovered not purity, but beautiful, profound complexity. Modern Japanese people carry all three ancestries. Jōmon genes that connect them to the first coastal migrations out of Africa. Yayoi genes linking them to East Asian agricultural civilizations. Kofun period genes connecting them to continental Asian empires. This isn't weakness, it's strength. It's proof that human populations have always survived through mixing, through adaptation, through accepting new peoples and new ideas, and creating hybrid identities that are richer than any pure origin could be. The question isn't whether we're pure. We're not. No population is. The question is whether we can accept the complexity that genetics reveals and build identities around shared humanity rather than mythical purity. I want to hear your thoughts on this genetic discovery. In the comments below, tell me, does this change how you think about national identity and ancestry? What happens when science proves that origin stories we've been taught are incomplete? And if you have Japanese ancestry, or ancestry from any nation with strong origin narratives, how does genetic complexity affect your sense of identity? Because DNA keeps proving that the stories we tell about pure origins and unmixed bloodlines were always false. Humanity has survived and thrived through mixing, through acceptance of difference, through building identities that are complex rather than simple. Your ancestry isn't pure. It's a river fed by countless tributaries, carrying water from sources you'll never know. And that's not just okay, it's beautiful. It's proof that connection, not separation, defines human history. The ancestors are speaking through DNA. The question is, are we ready to listen?